Thank you for joining us today on Research and Science Diaries. I am Funa Cyprien. I am a PhD candidate at the Virgin University of Brussels. I am doing my research in targeted radionuclide therapy. Today, we will be talking on some burning issues which involve research, which involve science. And today, our focus will be on early science, science careers and early people getting into research. I am joined today by Michael Horseman. Michael Horseman is a professor of experimental oncology at the Aarhus University Hospital in Denmark. Mike, thank you very much for joining us on this special discussion. Can you take
Thanks
a
for the
moment
invite.
to introduce yourself?
I'm employed by Aarhus University, but I work at the hospital in a cancer department. I'm originally a radiation biologist by training and came to Denmark many years ago. And I'm responsible for a lot of preclinical translational research, primarily working with radiation.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And again, thank you for joining us today, because the discussion today, I think it's one of the important things that drive for researchers and maybe one of the foundations of present-day scientists and present-day major researchers. But I think one of the important things, especially for PhD candidates to choose, is to be able to select a good research topic and an advisor who will guide him through the mandate. I would like to know from you, what should somebody who is interested in research do? What should they take into account when selecting a research topic?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, students usually have some idea of what sort of area they would like to do their research project in. Either they've heard something, read something, or often when students are doing a bachelor or master's degree, they may have undertaken a small research project and they want to continue in that area. If you know what it is, then you have some idea of who's actually active in those areas. So you would investigate to see whether those people actually have PhD projects ongoing, whether they're taking people. You should also, at that time, also try and look and see who is the supervisor, what is their experience, what does the project really involve? Because a lot of PhD students don't really know what they want to do. They want to carry on with a PhD, but they don't have anything in mind. So then it's a case of just trying to find out what's available and then see, is there anything that excites them? But again, if you see anything, you still want to have an idea of what's the project involve, who's responsible for it, what experience they have. And you can do this on the internet. You just go in and check things and see, look at their track record, their supervisor's track record for publications and so on. So you get a feeling for what you want. Now, there's no guarantee that you're going to end up with a project that's going to be successful or a supervisor that's going to be good. But by checking things out and trying to investigate things as much as possible before you sign up, you can eliminate or reduce the risk of things going wrong when you do it.
Thank you very much. I think that is that's very interesting, because along the line, this is what shapes how your mandate turns out. And also a point on advisors and how to carry on. We will see that later on in the discussion. Also, let's say someone has already had a topic, they already into the research, they've started their mandate. Something which is important is trying to develop some essential skills, because I think PhD comes along with, you should be able to have some particular skills to be able to drive you through. So which are some particular skills that are very essential for successful PhD mandate that you think PhD candidates should focus on in their early stage of their research?
Yeah, I think one of the things that most people forget is that the PhD is actually a learning process. You are learning to do research. So you got to be flexible, and you got to come in and really assume that you really don't know anything and you're going to learn. So accept that. Don't come in and think you're going to cure cancer with your research project. And that usually involves, first off, listening to the supervisor and their suggestions. What do they suggest you should do? And early on, a supervisor will guide you to start with. And as you develop, then you begin to become a little bit more independent. Yeah, it's important just to listen and study. And then you start to really, you got to look at the project and try and understand the project. And that really involves, you know, doing a lot of reading, checking things out, trying to find information around the background, find some nice reviews, read them, and talk to your supervisor in the early stages to get a plan of what you want to do and how you want to do it.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because when you start, sometimes you really need to be able to understand the literature, understand the background on your topic, and for you to be able to develop more skills and understand what you should focus on during your mandate. But sometimes when you're an early, where you just start with your PhD, it's a bit tricky on how to review papers, on how to search for papers, or how to search the literature for important papers. So what would you recommend for somebody to have an effective way of searching the literature for information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, today a lot of things are easier. You know, you can just go on PubMed and put in keywords. You know, you would already have had a project that's defined. You know what the project's about. That's part of the PhD application. When the supervisor decides they want a PhD student, they write a basic project. So you have some idea. Your supervisor early on will advise you, or should advise you, where to go and look, what sort of papers to read, how to look at different things. And it's a lot easier today. In the old days, it was a case of going to the library and finding books. There's a lot of legwork. Today, it's a lot easier with PubMed and so on. And I remember when I did my PhD, when I started, my supervisor basically said to me, you know nothing. Don't think you know anything. You know nothing now. We're going to teach you. But at the end of the 3 years, you would have learned all the necessary skills that would then allow you to go anywhere in the world and do independent research. And that's what you have to remember. It's a learning process. You start with nothing. You know, you probably have learned things that you can use in the PhD, but it's a learning process. At the end of the PhD, you would have received the necessary education to carry on doing independent research.
Indeed.
So don't worry so much. Don't worry so much about the early stage. Yeah. Get advice.
Yeah, indeed, because I think one of the things about PhD is you should try to remain blank and be open to learn. It gives you the ability to get into so many things and really benefit. One other thing too is, which is important, is sometimes we always start a PhD, we think that the 4 years is a lot of time. Maybe the 3 years, the 4 year, 5 year mandate is a lot of time, but it goes so fast that maybe you are unable to catch up with the goals or the objectives of your project. What are some of the important time management skills that PhD candidate could culture?
Yeah, good question. I think you have to remember that when you start your PhD project, there's usually a plan. There's aims, hypotheses, and you have an idea. You sit down with your supervisor, you're planning experiments. I don't think I've ever known a PhD project that actually follows that plan. It changes. You'll hit walls. There are things that won't work, and then you have to adapt. Now, the time factor really is, you've got to be prepared to put in the time that's necessary to do what's necessary. Now, research isn't a 9 to 5, 5 days a week job. There will be times when you'll be working 60 hours, maybe or more, on a particular project. You've got to learn to accept that that's going to happen. I remember doing a series of experiments as a PhD where we had to make measurements every couple of hours over a 24-hour period. That meant working through the night. But you've got to be prepared to do that. Now, it won't be like that all the time, and it shouldn't be like that all the time.
Yep.
You'll have 1 week perhaps where you're working 60 hours, and next week you probably only work much less. So it becomes a balance. Now, if you're single and you have no responsibilities, that's easy. If you've got a family, that becomes more difficult. And you have to try and find the balance where you can maintain a family life or whatever, and still do the research that's necessary. And, you know, it may be you'll have to work weekends. If you're not prepared to do that, I think you're going to have an issue when it comes to doing the PhD. You've got to be prepared to put in the time and efforts necessary to do what's necessary. And we always have a plan. This is what you're going to do in the 3 years. You know, you may only get 1/3 of the way through when you're finished. It doesn't matter. As long as you've done sufficient work to show that you've worked hard and developed the ability to work independently. That's it.
Indeed, you pointed something which is very important, and the thing is, generally no work plan or no project actually rolls out the way it was initially written, and this comes sometimes it really becomes a big challenge. It becomes a demotivating factor for PhD candidates, and the main question I want to know is, how can a PhD candidate overcome this challenge, like overcome the challenge of failures in the project, or as well as trying to stay motivated?
Yeah, failure in terms of project things not going the way they should, that's going to happen. It happens. What you got to learn to do is deal with it. And one of the things that often happens is someone prepares a project plan, they start working on it, and they get results that show this isn't working. And then they stop, and then they move over, they modify the project, and they do the same thing, and that shows it's not working, and they stop and they move over. And so they've got continually lots of projects that never got finished. I think one of the things you have to say to yourself is, okay, where am I in this project? If the project is totally dead, then it seems pointless to carry on working. But it's like, okay, if I do a couple more experiments, I can complete the story. It may be negative, but I've got it completed.
Yep.
And then you can sit down and say, okay, this part is finished. It didn't work, but I've completed it. So sometimes you don't want to end up with lots of unfinished projects. Not leading anywhere. You've got to complete it, and it is. And then you can get the satisfaction saying, hey, I've done that part. That part can go in the thesis. It didn't work out the way it was, but I demonstrated that I've done the right experiments. We approached it in the correct fashion. We got good results, but they're negative. There's no point in carrying on that way, but you've completed it, and that's important. And that will keep you motivated. It's completing things, ticking things off.
Thank you very much, Mike. That is one thing is, away from maybe the project failing or the project having challenges or not yielding results that we expected, or not rolling the way we expected. Another issue is sometimes PhD candidates find themselves in a very complicated relationship with their supervisors, and sometimes it also contributes a lot on PhD candidates dropping out on their mandate or abandoning their research. How can you advise PhD candidates to be able to navigate successfully through a situation like this? Because it's something very precarious, something very sensitive, and it's something very important. And sometimes it can be amended, it can always be fixed, but students always lack the experience on how to go about it. How can you highlight some points or some aspects to approach this?
Yeah, and a lot of the time it becomes a supervisor's responsibility. The supervisor should be willing to talk to the student and to listen to them. And the student shouldn't be frightened to go and speak to the supervisor. When you're working on a project, often students come in and they've got ideas. There's nothing wrong with coming with suggestions, but don't get upset if the supervisor says no. Because you have to remember the supervisor has a lot of experience, or should do. They know what's been done in the field. They've been around a long time. And then I've often had students come in and say, I'd like to do this or that. I say, there's no point. It was done 30 years ago and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And students shouldn't get upset. They should accept it and be willing to discuss the issue and then discuss it and say, ask the supervisor why. And the supervisor should tell them. So it has to be a situation where you've got to be willing to be flexible. You've got to be willing to talk to your supervisor. Your supervisor should be willing to talk to you. I have a policy here that my door is always open for my students.
Yeah.
They can come in and discuss anything with me. I don't always agree with them, and I tell them, but they can go away. They can get upset, but they shouldn't. It's like, I'm not there to make their life hard. The supervisor's not there. The supervisor wants you to succeed. If you don't succeed in the PhD, it's a reflection of the supervisor. So they want you to succeed. They're willing to listen. They should be willing to listen. They're willing to give advice, but the student has to accept that certain things are being said that may not fit with what they believe, and so on. But it has to be a balance between both of them talking. There are supervisors where they're not necessarily good supervisors, and then you have a situation where the student then probably has to go and speak to someone higher up in the system, the head of the department perhaps, or someone at the university that deals with these sort of issues. You have human resources if things start to not work out. So there's always someone you got to go and speak to, and often you can find a solution.
One thing too is you've carried on the research. You're moving to the end of your mandate. Now it's time to start thinking about your PhD thesis and probably a defense. What are some of the key elements for successfully writing a PhD thesis?
Yeah, the first thing, of course, is the thesis. What you're doing with your thesis is showing what you've done and how good you are at doing research. And often a good project with a lot of results can actually look bad if the thesis is written poorly. Same time, a not so good thesis can actually look good if it's prepared properly. So you've got to spend the time and effort in preparing the thesis. And it's a summary really of what you've done to demonstrate to people how good you are. So you've got to spend the time and effort doing it. You should never leave it to the end. It's like 3 months from the deadline. Okay, I'm going to start writing my thesis. It takes a lot longer to write your thesis than you expect. And everybody experiences that. They always say the same. It's taking longer than I planned. So make sure you set the time aside to prepare it. Now, you can actually start writing your thesis early on. You have a project, you have an introduction to the thesis. Yep. That's the background. You can write an introduction even at the beginning. Sometimes it's a good idea to actually sit down and try and write a review type summary of the project. You can always modify it, but you've got it there at the time. The materials and methods, for example, every time you do an experiment, you've got the materials and methods there. You can write that up. You don't have to leave it to the end. The results and the discussion you can't do until you've got the results and you've got the discussion. But there's a lot of things you can do early on. You need to take the time. You need to spend the time. If your English is not so good and it's an English thesis, you've got to make sure someone that's a native English speaker reads it to fix it. You've got to make sure your supervisors have time to go through it, to make suggestions. They will come with suggestions to improve the overall thesis. If you have a rush job, you end up making silly mistakes. You'll put things in there and you'll just write something and then you'll move on. You've got to go back and read, reread and check, and you'll find silly mistakes. Often as an examiner, when I'm going through theses, I find people make comments that's like, wow, this is wrong. And then it gives you a good opportunity to discuss with them or put them under pressure. Yeah. It's very common. One of the biggest mistakes you see is references. People put references in and don't actually then go through the references to find out, was it the correct reference? have I done it properly? Often you see references where they're incomplete, you know, things are missing, authors are missing, the title's missing, the year and anything like that. People say, oh, it's in reference manager, I just copy it over, and things sometimes go wrong. So you got to check it. Take your time. Start early and take your time writing it. And check, double check.
How can a student prepare for their defense? Because it's at the end of the day, it's the cap of the PhD.
Yeah, it is. I think the first thing you should always remember is that you have done the work in the thesis. You have written the thesis. Nobody knows that thesis better than you. Indeed. So any questions related to that should not be an issue. You have to make sure that everything in the thesis, you know what it is. All the different methods, how you did different things. Sometimes you may have collaborated with somebody to produce some data that goes in your thesis. So you never actually did the experiments, but it's part of your study. You still need to know what was involved. We have equipment here where it can take 3 to 6 months to become familiar with using it. And if you are doing a project where you want one experiment with 6 animals and you want the measurements, it's crazy spending 3 to 6 months learning how to use this machine when you're only going to do one simple experiment. So we have experts that do it. They will produce the data for you, but it's relevant to your project, so it should go in your thesis. But you need to know every detail about how that data was produced, because you're going to get questions on it. So even if you didn't do the experiment, if it's in the thesis, you've got to know about it. So in that aspect, you shouldn't have a problem if you prepare that way. Of course, the examiners are going to ask you questions on your thesis, but also questions around your thesis. And there, you don't actually know where they're going to go. Anything that you present in your thesis, they can take it to the side and start asking questions. Now, you can get a clue as to that. Often, a lot of thesis exams, the student gets a written report from the opponents beforehand. That can give you clues of where the opponents are likely to start asking questions. So you should start reading up in those areas. One other trick you can do is find, who the opponent is or the examiner. What's his favorite area of expertise? What does he like to work on? 9 times out of 10, people like to talk about what they know. So there could be questions there. So you just find what they did, check a few things. How does that, is there anything that they've been working on that's related to your thesis? It can give you a clue where they're going to go. And then you've got to prepare. I mean, you've just got to read around the thesis. And a lot of this you would have done as your thesis develops. You would have read reviews by other people. You would have read papers by other people's. Try to remember that. One of the other things that you should never do, and this is the same for any publication, you shouldn't put any reference in a publication or in your thesis that you haven't read. Now, you've got maybe 150, 200 references, but over a 3-year period, you should have seen those. Don't just read the abstract and then refer to that publication. You've got to know what was in there, because it's not unusual for an examiner to say, oh, well, you mentioned so-and-so study. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And if you only read the abstract, you've got a problem. So just make sure you do that. So it's just preparing as much as you can. You'll never know what's going to happen. And that's the preparation. Now, when you're defending your thesis, you have to remember you're trying to demonstrate how good you are.
Yeah,
and
because
it should be a discussion with the examiner. If the examiner asks you something, you shouldn't answer yes or no. Yes, that's it. No, that's not true. You can say yes, but then follow up on it, discuss it, try to demonstrate to them and whoever's there watching the defense that you know more about this. So,
indeed, because that was something I wanted to follow up on, because sometimes during the presentation, you can really mess it up yourself by doing certain things that you should not do.
Yeah.
And because the question I wanted to follow up on was, what are some of the things you should do and you shouldn't do during your presentation?
Okay. Now, every thesis defense is different. Here in Aarhus, the students get 45 minutes to present their thesis before the actual examination. Now, if you get that, you've got to present an overall picture of what you've done. You shouldn't go into minute details. You should give a summary so people sitting there in the audience can understand exactly what you did in a stepwise fashion. So you present it. Do it clearly and do it logically. I always insist that before my students defend, they always present their presentation to me, so I can hear it, I can make recommendations of how they should change it. Also, it gives me an idea of some of the questions that might come up. And as I said, once that's done, then there's the discussion with you and the examiner, and make it a discussion. And take your time. When the examiner asks you a question, think about what they said and then try and answer that question. Listen to what they said. Often people are very nervous. That's natural. You don't actually hear what's said and you start answering and speaking, which you go off on a tangent. You're not answering the question, but then you could go into an area that maybe you don't want to go into because the examiner can then pick up on that. So they asked you a specific question, listen to it and try and answer it. If you don't understand the question, don't be afraid to say, I don't understand the question, or I didn't get it. Can you repeat it? And then try to respond in the best way you can. Sometimes the examiners will ask you questions where they don't actually expect you to know the answer. And this is because when you're a qualified scientist, you will be making presentations. You will get questions that you don't really know the answer to, but you come with an answer.
And you can start the discussion on
the discussion. It's like, well, how do you deal with that? I've often asked questions where I don't know the answer to. I want to see how the student deals with that. And it's like, yeah, if they come with an answer, it's like, oh, wow, good. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. Another thing is after PhD life, because sometimes we get into the PhD, we are done with the PhD, but at the end, sometimes we don't know where we need to focus on. Where do we go from here? Where do we go into the industry, into academia? So what are some of the career options that exist after your PhD or after PhD life?
Right, there's a number of career options. I mean, some people get their PhD and then they go into something totally different. They don't actually use it. They have the qualification. You can go into teaching, for example. That's one area where you can teach at a low, school level up to university level. Depends on what positions are available. If you want to go into an academic career, like carry on doing research, first you've got to find a position. There may be positions available in the group that you did your PhD in. There's this argument that it's not good to carry on doing research in the same place you did your PhD. You should always move away. That's not necessarily true, but the problem you have is when you're doing your PhD, you're being influenced by the people around you.
Around you, yeah.
You may be producing papers, but the question always is, was it you that really came up with the idea, developed the plan, and did everything? Or did your supervisor guide you in a lot of way? Now, if you stay on in the institute and you stay on doing the same, working on a similar project, there's still to be that question mark. Is it you or is it somebody else? Yeah. If you move away and do just as good research, then everybody knows everything that was in the thesis was you. So it can tell you that. But you have to decide what's best for you, and that will be influenced by what you want to do. You know, if you're working in a country and you don't want to leave the country, you have family, you can't move, then you probably may need to stay.
Yeah.
If you're free, you can move around. You have to accept the fact that when you're in doing academic research, funding becomes an issue. You're going to have to get funding. Now, you may be part of a big group where they have plenty of funding, so that you then become part of that group. You're paid a salary and you're just producing data that goes into the group's project. And they keep getting funding as a big funding. You may end up in a situation where you have to get independent funding, and that becomes more difficult. It's not easy to do. You need experience in being able to do that. And so you have to weigh up those pros and cons. Do I want to get into a research area? If I go into this, but join this particular group, I'm responsible for getting independent funding, and that can be difficult to do. If you go into industry, you don't have that pressure in the same way.
Yeah.
But then there's a tendency not to have so much freedom. You will be doing what the industry people want you to do. And that can be a little, some people enjoy that, but other people find that a little bit negative, a little bit controlling. It depends. But you get into that, you have the ability to move up the system and become a person that actually starts making decisions. So I think you have to look at the different areas and say, what do I really want to do before you can actually make a decision? And you need to know what are the pros and cons of each of the aspect. And that's a case of sitting down and looking. And they change depending on where you go. Yep. To academic positions, the pressure can be totally different.
And like you highlight, one of the important aspects is if you have to go to industry, I think the skills which are necessary for success, for being successful in industry is a little more just different from when you are in academia.
Yeah.
What are some of the tips for you or some of the skills that you really need to be able to successfully transition from academia into industry? Because sometimes I think it's a bit somehow different. What is your take on that?
Yeah, that for me is a difficult one to answer because I've never worked in industry. I've collaborated with people in industry, and I just feel that if you've completed your PhD and it's a research project, you've demonstrated your ability to do research, both independently but also work with other people. And I think if you're going into industry, you're probably going to want to demonstrate that you can work alongside other people. You can listen to what's being told and do what you're told to do. Yeah. I don't know how much freedom you get in industry. I've always been under the impression the freedom may be less because they have specific issues that they want to work on. They have ideas of what needs to be done. You will be, as you come in, you will be, I assume, part of the discussion of how these things should go. So you'll have input there, but you're more pushed. You have to do this. Whereas in academia, there's projects, they have grants to do certain projects, but there is a certain amount more flexibility to move the project a little bit to the side, as long as it's still within the general overview. Yep. You're not under pressure to produce data that's going to lead to people making money.
Indeed. What are some of the common mistakes that you feel PhD students should avoid during their journey from start to the finish?
Probably the most common mistake is not listening to the supervisor, what they advise and what they say. Don't be frightened to discuss things with the supervisor, but it's like your supervisor's there. They were the one that came up with this proposal for the PhD project, so they have an idea of how it should go. They have the experience. They can tell you what to do, how to do things. So you should listen to them. Second is when you're looking at papers and what's been done before, seems to be a bit of a consensus that if it's more than 10 years old, a publication, it's irrelevant. Don't accept that. Be willing to go back and look at papers that are 20 to 30 years ago, because you can actually find things that people actually may have started working on similar to the project you're doing And they ran into problems, and you can see what those problems were. And that can, you may have had an idea of doing things in a certain way. People have tried it, it didn't work. And then it's like, oh, okay, I won't waste my time. But they can also give you ideas of things that maybe you should look at. So you want to do that. You should always get advice from people, but make sure it's advice from the right people. Don't start talking to people that have absolutely no concept about the project and try to get them to advise you on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. So that make sure that when you're doing your project, you plan properly. You plan the experiments properly. You know why, you know what to do and how to do it. There's a phrase that lack of planning equals cock up. People use that, and it's true. If you don't plan properly, you can end up doing things that you shouldn't. It's like, oops, I haven't done the right controls in this experiment. You can do a whole series of experiments and then realize you haven't done the right controls. Without that, all the results you have are totally meaningless. So you've got to make sure you have all the necessary groups or things that you need to look at, and you're going to do it in the right way. If you're going to make some measurements, make sure you're using the machine correctly. You're not doing things with the machine that is not technically possible. But then again, your supervisor will know this, or if he doesn't, he will put you in contact with people that can help you. Okay, I'm not sure of this particular technique, but it's something we need to do. You need to go and speak to these people. They're the experts here, and get their advice, and then come back to me and tell me what it is they suggest, and then we take it from there. And again, as I said before, try to complete projects. Just don't do a few experiments. No, that's not working. Throw it to the side. Do a few more experiments. That's not working. Throw it away. You don't want to spend a lot of time doing stuff and have nothing to show for it. So try to organize it so it's like, okay, that's not working, but I need to just do one more experiment to finish it off. Make it a nice little complete story, because then that story goes into your thesis. Now, one of the other things that I didn't mention is that some theses are based on publications. We have that Aarhus University. They want you to put publications in. So you write a general introductory chapter, and then you have all your publications. Publications don't always include all the data that you produced.
Indeed.
For the publications. Now, you should make sure that that other data that's not in the papers actually goes into your thesis, doesn't get left in the drawer. You can put it in an appendix, but some institutions don't accept appendices. But in the introductory chapter, which is a summary, you probably have a summary of the results section. You can actually put all that data in there. So you're demonstrating, hey, I got this publication, but I did a hell of a lot of work to get there.
Yep.
And so that's it. And that's basically it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think we are coming to the end of our discussion, and I'll have one last question. Being somebody that you've guided a lot of PhD candidates, a lot of medical doctors, a lot of reviews, a lot of papers and stuff, what differentiates a good PhD candidate from the rest of the crowd? Let's say what makes a PhD candidate stands out?
Yeah, I think it's for me it's someone that produces a good thesis, and it's a thesis that they've developed it from beginning to end. They've been involved in the development. They're students that are willing to come and talk to me and discuss things so that we know what's happening. We try to go things in a logical fashion. If things are not working, we come with a solution. I like to get their input. I hope they listen to me. I hope that I listen to them. Make sure that everything you do is well planned. Think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and if it doesn't work, why didn't it work? What can you take from that? How can you, if the thesis is going this way and it stops, how can you go around it? And don't cut corners. Just complete the projects. and be prepared to work hard. If you put in the time and effort and you do things in the right way, your thesis should be a success. And finally, of course, make sure that the presentation at the end, the thesis and the examination reflects your ability. As I said before, a good thesis can be considered not good if the presentation is poor. Really, you know, if the thesis, the way it's written, the way you defend it, people can say, wow, that wasn't a very good thesis, when in fact it was. And vice versa happens. You know, you can take a thesis that's not so good and make it sound like a wonderful thing if your presentation is really good.
Indeed, they say delivery is everything.
Yeah, exactly. So just, you know, prepare to put in the time and take the time that's necessary. Work hard.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much for accepting to talk this to us. We really benefited from your rich experience and your know-how.